Today Matter.
Thanks to Eddie and Thula for organizing this event and for inviting me to be part of it. Yesterday we were talking about the tension between morality and pragmatism with respect to sanctions. I'm going to argue that in the case of Rhodesia, I think it's a tension between morality and duplicity. And this is something that comes from thinking about this issue of sanctions for quite a while. If you look back in 1988, William Minter and Elizabeth Schmidt published an article which was entitled "When Sanctions Worked," and they were arguing that sanctions actually did work to bring about the end of the crisis in Rhodesia. And I thought about it for a year or two, and I did a paper which was a response to that article, which was entitled "Prelude to the 1979 Lancaster House Constitutional Conference in Rhodesia, the Role of International Economic Sanctions Reconsidered," and argued that in fact sanctions were not that effective, and that the change can be better explained by the pressure that was mounted by the liberation movements in the context of changing world. But I wasn't too sure why they didn't quite work. I suspected that South Africa and Portugal were behind this story. So I did another study, this time entitled "We Have Blood Relations over the Border, South Africa and Rhodesian Sanctions, 1965 to 1975. And it's very clear that South Africa did play a very pivotal role in subverting sanctions, as well as Portugal. But I'm going to argue that they were not the only ones. That virtually all the countries that were signatories to the resolutions that introduced sanctions, almost all of them broke sanctions. So we start with UDI in 1965, and Britain coming under pressure from the Afro-Asian bloc, with the African countries particularly demanding that Britain send in the military to sort out this illegal regime. And Harold Wilson, who was the Prime Minister at the time, decides that he would not go that route and suggests that sanctions would be the way to go, and creates the impression that this is going to be a walkover. He says it's not going to take months, it's going to take a few weeks. But as we know, Rhodesia survived for a very long time after that. So how do we explain that? In any case, UDI was followed almost immediately by condemnation right across the globe, with Britain itself being the first country to impose a variety of sanctions on the country. Then on November 12th, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 216, calling on states neither to recognize nor to render any assistance to the illegal regime in Rhodesia. 8 days later, the Security Council passed Resolution 217 of 1965, exhorting states to sever diplomatic relations with the Smith government and encouraging the United Kingdom to vigorously enforce the sanctions it had already imposed on the colony. Next came the UN Security Council Resolution 232 of 1966, declaring the situation in southern Rhodesia a threat to international peace and security, and calling on states to prevent the import into their territories of Rhodesian asbestos, iron ore, chrome, pig iron, sugar, tobacco, copper, meat and meat products, preventing the transfer of funds to Rhodesia, any trade in arms, ammunition for all types, military aircraft, military vehicles, equipment and materials for the manufacture of maintenance of arms and ammunition, the supply of motor vehicles or equipment for the manufacture of motor vehicles, a very comprehensive list of items that were not to be traded with Rhodesia. And this was followed later on in 1968 by Resolution 253, which was also imposing another set of limitations of what could be the interaction between member states and Rhodesia. So in terms of what was on paper by the end of 1968, the program was very, very comprehensive. so that if sanctions had been enforced scrupulously, clearly Rhodesia would not have survived for more than a few weeks, given the size of the population, which Louise White refers to as a Sabbath masquerading as a nation. We're talking about 250,000 or so whites in the country, in a landlocked country, which is very heavily dependent on trade, particularly with Britain and Europe. And yet it's able to last for many years, despite this sanctions regime. So something doesn't quite add up. Okay? So I'm going to argue that the role that South Africa played is fairly important, but I think it has to be seen within the context of how many other people who publicly supported sanctions privately went about subverting them. Okay? And the evidence is coming from United Nations Security Council Sanctions Committee. I call it Sanctions Committee. It's got a very long name, which you will find in the paper, which was established by Resolution 253, 1968, which was to monitor the implementation of sanctions on Rhodesia, and it was to receive, quote-unquote, information from states, specialized agencies, international organizations, as well as private individuals regarding the implementation and alleged breaches of sanctions, and to recommend to the Council ways and means by which member states could more effectively carry out the Security Council decisions regarding sanctions. So if you like, this was almost like a network to collect information about who is breaking sanctions, and then advising the Security Council what to do. The problem, however, is that this committee did not have any powers to discipline anybody. All it could do was to report to the Security Council. And the second problem is that the Security Council itself didn't have the power to discipline anybody. This ended up being really sort of a name and shame kind of exercise. And in the absence of any sanctions against those who were breaking sanctions, it was very tempting and very easy for people to do so. Okay? So 2 years later, by March 1970, the Security Council was already expressing regret that, quote-unquote, the measures so far taken have failed to bring the rebellion in southern Rhodesia to an end, and stating that this was partly because, quote-unquote, some states, contrary to UN resolutions, have failed to prevent trade with the illegal regime in southern Rhodesia, and the fact that the Republic of South Africa and Portugal have continued to give assistance to southern Rhodesia. This became the refrain for the duration of UDI. Almost every year, the Security Council would issue a statement which read almost like the first one. So as late as 1977, the Security Council was still, quote-unquote, deeply concerned that sanctions have so far failed to bring to an end the illegal regime. And again, pointing out, sanctions cannot put an end to that regime unless they are strictly supervised and unless measures are taken against the states which violate them. So as late as 1977, the sanctions have not had any impact, and the Security Council doesn't know how to make them work better because of this lack of mechanisms to sanction those who deliberately violated them. So the major weakness of sanctions from the very beginning was the refusal of Portugal and South Africa to support that international initiative. There were also a number of countries that were not governed by the United Nations. And I'm thinking of Japan, of East Germany, which were not members as of '68. I think they were only admitted in 1973. So they were not really bound by those measures. And I'm thinking of Switzerland, which, because of its policy of neutrality, refused to be part of this international arrangement. And the Federal Council of Switzerland sent a message to the United Nations Security Council saying that because of its neutral state, it cannot submit to the mandatory sanctions of the United Nations. But it did promise, however, that it would see to it that Rhodesian trade was given no opportunity to avoid United Nations sanctions through Swiss territory. the most misleading statement I've ever read in history, because Switzerland became the financier of the sanctions-breaking enterprise across the globe. Okay, so members of the General Assembly, particularly the African members, were concerned that Portugal and South Africa were allowed to evade sanctions, and they continued to put pressure on the Security Council to force these two countries to be part of the international arrangement. The first effort was Resolution 2383 of 1968 in the General Assembly, calling on the Security Council to make sure that the two countries complied. And I would argue that demonstrating the lack of will on the part of the big powers to ensure that sanctions against Rhodesia were strictly enforced. Significantly, the United States and Britain voted with South Africa and Portugal to reject the resolution. Subsequent attempts, and there were many, to extend sanctions to South Africa and Portugal failed consistently because the two countries vetoed or voted against that resolution. Therefore, these two countries were allowed to continue to violate sanctions. But as I say, they were not the only ones. At least these two countries were very open about what they were doing. Many of the countries that I'm going to discuss in the next few minutes, on the face of it, were very supportive of sanctions. They had voted in support of all the resolutions that I've spoken about. And each one went on to violate these sanctions. And the list of countries that are mentioned in those records that I went through is a very long one. It includes France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Italy, Greece, West Germany, Britain, the United States of America, Israel, various African countries, which would include Gabon, Kenya, Angola, Malawi, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, and Southwest Africa, Brazil, Mauritius, Taiwan, among others. So literally, the entire globe is involved in this, exercise of violating, sanctions. There were suggestions too, and I spoke to Vladimir yesterday, and I think we need to look into this further, that even those countries that were supposed to be supporting the struggle against colonialism were themselves part of the violation of sanctions. And one complaint that is lodged with the Council names the Soviet Union and its East European counterparts, China, and so forth. The Japanese, on their part, took advantage of the withdrawal of British capital, if you like, from South Africa to literally replace that market with their own goods. So in the 60s and 70s, you find German, Japanese, French, and Dutch exports increase exponentially at a time when they're supposed to be cutting ties with this country. Let me look at one or two case studies to substantiate what I'm arguing. France is a good start. We heard about France yesterday from Professor Mazarire, so I won't go into great detail about the overall approach of France to sanctions. I will, however, revisit the aspect of the support given to the Rhodesian economy in terms of automobiles or cars. Throughout the 60s and 70s, as Professor Mazarire pointed out yesterday, most of the cars that were found on the streets were actually French cars. 50% of all the cars on the streets of Rhodesia were produced by two major French car manufacturers, Renault and Peugeot. And if you want sort of clarification of that, I think Ian Smith, for the duration of his time, was driving around with a Peugeot, right? Okay, just underline just that connection. Okay, but you also had your Citroen, then you had German cars, BMW, Alfa Romeo. So the whole sort of European car manufacturing industry is involved in sanctions busting, and they're sending either fully built cars or components of cars, because they are running car assembly businesses in Rhodesia, particularly in a place called Willover. But of course, when they're challenged by the Sanctions Committee, they all deny that they're exporting anything to Rhodesia. They say we're exporting these things to Rhodesia's neighbors. And we know Rhodesia's neighbors were South Africa and Portugal and Mozambique for a long time. So essentially, they were sending these things to Rhodesia through these two. Then France also supplied Mirage F-1 planes and Maxtra rocket launchers to the Rhodesian Air Force and Army, and sold a number of diesel locomotives to Rhodesia through the Mozambican port of Beira. A French bank was named as one of the several international banks which had pledged secret loans for the construction of a steel plant in Rhodesia. I'll come back to that because that's a major scandal towards the middle of this period. UTA, which was the French travel company, continued to maintain offices in Salisbury for the duration of UDI, and therefore facilitating travel as well as trade between the two countries. But I think much more interesting for me, apart from this fairly clear violation of sanctions, is the connection that Professor Mazari made yesterday of France and African countries that were brought on board to help Rhodesia to break sanctions. And the best example is what we started talking about yesterday, which is Gabon, which whose president was very enthusiastic in working with France to ensure that Rhodesia got supplied with everything it wanted. His name was Omar Bongo. Working with Bongo was a Rhodesian man called Jack Mallock, who is reported to have been, at one stage, an alleged CIA agent, a participant in several African wars and coups, a man who did some work for the French Secret Service in the Katanga during the Congo crisis of the 1960s, smuggler of arms into Biafra during the Nigerian Civil War, and a man closely involved with the notorious mercenary Bob Denard. I don't know whether you remember him from those years. And he was also closely linked with the Rhodesian Special Air Service Regiment, which participated in some of the long-range cross-border operations. So he was a man of many parts, which is why the link between him and Omar Bongo is a very surprising one, because this man is clearly not a supporter of a struggle for African independence. And yet Gabon is a member of the OAU, which means technically it should be supporting the struggle in Southern Africa. But what this Mallock guy do? Well, he registered his airline called Trans-Africa Airline, which was established in 1964. Registered it as a Gabonese airline with the support, of course, of Omar Bongo. And then when this airline collapsed, he set up Afritair, which smuggled Rhodesian beef disguised as Gabonese into the European and African markets, even though Gabon did not produce any beef at all. Afritair cargo was carrying loads of beef and other Rhodesian products from Salisbury to Libreville, where Bongo's people would then have papers of a registered aircraft and cargo manifest, showing that the cargo originated in Gabon. And using these planes, Rhodesia was able to subvert international sanctions. He also set up a number of dummy companies in Liechtenstein and other European countries to smuggle goods into Europe and into Rhodesia. Like many public figures who outwardly supported sanctions but secretly violated them, Bongo was unfazed by his conduct, as evident in the fact that in June-July of 1977, he hosted an Organization of African Unity Council of Ministers meeting in Gabon, which drew up the following resolution. Resolution condemning, quote-unquote, all kinds of collaboration with the racist illegal regime of Rhodesia, countries of the world, particularly those sanctions breaking Western countries, as well as Japan and Israel. and urging them to put an end to their economic trade and military, sports and telecommunications, and other kinds of cooperation with the retrogressive regime of Salisbury. The Gabonese Minister of Foreign Affairs participated fully in drawing up this resolution, knowing very well that his country was one of the worst offenders. When the country was challenged later on by the Sanctions Committee, well, it did come under pressure, and then the response was that, well, what we've done is that we have now disbanded Afritair, but it's now incorporated into Gabonese air. But the personnel remains the same, and they're still doing what they're doing as Afritair. So essentially, the sanctions busting is still continuing despite the pressure from everywhere. Britain, I think, is another one that we need to look at. As the colonial power which had invoked sanctions against the rebel regime of Ian Smith, it would have been expected that Britain would be exemplary in its observance and enforcement of international sanctions. The truth, however, was that British companies, sometimes with the knowledge of the British government, contravened sanctions. They contravened their own sanctions. This is, I think, partly because Britain imposed sanctions only as a way to save face in the context of the pressure from the Afro-Asian nations. I don't think there was any belief in the efficacy of sanctions from the very beginning. As I'll show you later on, Wilson himself admits that he knew about sanctions busting by British companies. So when you are saying you are supporting international sanctions, you're actually lying to the world. So Shell and BP continued to contravene sanctions from day one. First of all, by ferrying oil by road through Beitbridge, and later by railway from the Mozambican port of Lourenço Marques. In 1967, annoyed at the fact that it was being constantly accused by the British government of breaking international sanctions, the Portuguese government revealed that out of the total of 169 oil tankers which entered Lourenço Marques between April 1966 and May 1967, 58 of them were of British nationality. In 1976, an investigative report by the Center for Social Action of the United Church of Christ, entitled The Oil Conspiracy, confirmed that South African subsidiaries Mobil, Caltex, Total, Shell, and BP had, since the United Declaration of Independence, supplied Rhodesia with all its oil requirements. And that they did this by selling oil to a South African company called Freight Services Limited, which, with the knowledge and intention of the oil companies, had sold the oil to Rhodesia. The United Kingdom, the Netherlands, France, and the United States, where these companies were headquartered, received this incriminating report, but did absolutely nothing to either further investigate on their own or to reprimand the oil companies concerned. In fact, the British government wrote back to the committee to say it had investigated this allegation, and it had found, quote unquote, neither those companies nor any company in which they had an interest had engaged either directly or indirectly in the supply of crude oil products to Rhodesia. The British government was lying outrightly, because the arrangement to send oil to Rhodesia was discussed between the leaders of the oil companies, Shell and BP, and some members of the British government. So this was, if you like, duplicity of the extreme. Meanwhile, in 1966, Britain deployed its Royal Navy, commonly known as the Patrol, off the Mozambican coast, ostensibly to enforce the oil embargo by preventing oil tankers offloading their cargo at Beira. The Navy was only withdrawn in 1976 following the independence of Mozambique from Portugal. I'm arguing that patrolling the Mozambican channel was merely a public relations exercise, because Rhodesia was still able to import oil through Mozambique's southern port of Lourenço Marques, which the Royal Navy did not patrol for fear of offending South Africa. In March 1977, Martin Bailey published another study, Shell and BP in South Africa, highlighting the role the two companies still played in keeping Rhodesia's oil needs supplied. This is 1977. The sanctions have been imposed since 1968. So oil has been going to Rhodesia all these years when sanctions were in place. It was the publicity following the report, this report, that eventually spurred Prime Minister James Callaghan to set up the Bingham Commission of Inquiry to investigate how Rhodesia had been obtaining oil since UDI and whether British oil companies had been involved in selling oil to the country. In its 1978 report, the Commission recorded that Shell and BP had been supplying Rhodesia with oil for most of the period since the UDI. The report confirmed that following the imposition of the oil embargo in December 1965, oil and oil products had been sent to Rhodesia by road from South Africa. Then in December 1966, Shell Mozambique Limited, which was owned by both Shell and BP, began supplying oil from the Middle East from Shell and BP's Durban refinery directly to Rhodesia through Lorenzo Marcus, even though Shell Mozambique was a British company registered in London and therefore subject to British sanctions legislation. Again, this oil was sold to Rhodesia through middlemen companies that then sent the oil to Rhodesia. Then, in order to cover up their illegal activities, Shell and BP, with the full approval of their head offices, began in January 1968 to operate on the basis of a swap arrangement in which, instead of supplying oil directly to Rhodesia, they would reimburse the French company Total for the amount of oil that Total would have supplied to Rhodesia on their behalf. And this arrangement was accepted and endorsed by the Shell and BP executives and a British government minister, George Thompson, at two meetings held on 21 February 1968 and 6 February 1969. It is alleged that on being informed of the swap arrangement, Thompson had replied that, quote unquote, since the government could truthfully say that no British oil was reaching Rhodesia, its position was quite defensible. According to another source, at least two ministers in Wilson's cabinet and high-ranking civil servants were told about this swap arrangement. Thus, the violation of sanctions by British companies continued with the full knowledge and approval of some members of the British government until Mozambique's independence in 1976, by which time Shell and BP had supplied, quote-unquote, about 2 million tons, constituting nearly 20% of Rhodesia's needs since 1966. So government was fully in the picture about this arrangement because apparently it also members of the government participated at these meetings between the oil companies and its representatives in 1968 and 1969. So the British government was happy to support sanction busting by Shell and BP as long as this remained a secret and the companies did not supply oil directly to Rhodesia. This was acknowledged by the former Prime Minister Harold Wilson in 1978 when he said that he had known that British oil was reaching Rhodesia, but had been satisfied, quote unquote, that the oil was not being supplied by British oil companies themselves. Thus, his government agreed to the swap arrangement, but resolved to keep this a secret, lest British sincerity on enforcing the embargo be questioned. Harold Wilson maintained this charade of insisting that his administration had faith in the sanctions policy, even though the British government had known as early as December 1967 that economic sanctions had not stopped oil from reaching Rhodesia. It was in the face of such blatant duplicity that President Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia was well justified to declare that, quote unquote, Wilson lied to me just as he lied to the world, especially given the fact that he'd been wrecking Portugal and the United States and other countries over the calls for supplying Rhodesia with oil, while he knew that British governments were actually doing the same. And then I won't go into this, with British multinational companies that remained in Rhodesia and actually expanded during UDI, Lonro and Anglo-American. In the paper, I detail their properties and when they were acquired during UDI. As for the United States, I won't go into much there because I've got two experts on that country here. Eddie's paper yesterday, I think, was very illuminating in terms of what the United States did. I just want to highlight one or two other aspects of, apart from the Baird Amendment and all that, other ways in which the United States violated international sanctions. Despite the fact that Resolution 253 prohibited tourists from visiting Rhodesia, in August 1974, newspaper columnist Jack Anderson reported that hundreds of US travel agencies had violated sanctions for years by arranging tourist visits to Rhodesia, and that in 1973 alone, 20% of Rhodesia's visitors were from the United States. Meanwhile, the Rhodesian Information Office in Washington, D.C., and the Air Rhodesia office in New York City, whose general manager was also the representative of the Rhodesian United Touring Company, were allowed to continue to operate in violation of UN sanctions in the United States. The Rhodesian offices were also facilitating the violation of sanctions in other ways. I'm thinking here of the head of that Rhodesia office, information office in the United States, facilitating the entry into the United States of one Melvin Ayet, who was a high-ranking officer at Air Rhodesia in Rhodesia, to visit the United States in 1973 to meet with executives of McDonnell Douglas, of Boeing, of United Airlines, to arrange for the purchase of 3 Boeing 720s for Air Rhodesia. And those resolutions specified very clearly that this was to be avoided. As a result, Rhodesian pilots were smuggled into the United States. They went in with false passports through Germany and were trained to fly these new aircraft in Denver, Colorado, by United Airlines. The American Airlines also supplied at least one of the aircraft that Malloch used to run his smuggling business under Afritair. It was a DC-8, which was supplied also by the United States. These pilots, then after finishing their training, flew to Switzerland, where the process of acquiring those 3 720s, Boeing 720s, was underway. So the training was just in time for them to be able to fly those planes to Rhodesia. Unfortunately, the Swiss authorities did not validate their flying licenses. So German pilots flew these planes to Lisbon, where the Rhodesian pilots were able to take them back to Rhodesia. How much time do you have?
Probably 5 minutes or
so. Okay. According to the Captain Service of Air Rhodesia, you are saying, we've been trying to get these planes for a long time, and we got offers from all over European nations, but there was always a hitch. But he ended, it would surprise a few United Nations officials to know which countries were willing to sell to us. So despite sanctions, people were quite willing to do business with Rhodesia. The Netherlands was another country that was at the forefront of breaking sanctions. I won't go into much detail about this, but there was a company called Zephyr, which was established as a paper company to disguise the operations of a company called Joba Trading, which had been in existence for many years and had done trade in pharmaceuticals with Rhodesia, but now was moving on to other items that Rhodesia needed. And it had a network of contacts right across the world. The list of where Joba was connected, where it had its own people who were part of this network, is very impressive. West Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, Belgium, Japan, United States, Switzerland, China, France, Finland, Chile, Israel, Hungary, Sweden, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, the Soviet Union, Cuba, German Democratic Republic, Turkey, Spain, Denmark, I mean the list goes on. And this Joba company was operating this international network, not only in terms of supplying goods and services to Rhodesia, but also in smuggling Rhodesian tobacco, which was then distributed through this network. Particularly the Rothman tobacco empire was part of this network to disperse Rhodesian tobacco. The government was informed by the committee, and the government did absolutely nothing. In fact, they didn't report back that they hadn't found anything to support that charge. In terms of other countries, this is where it becomes much more complicated. It becomes clear that by 1974, there is a big conspiracy to provide funding for the establishment of a steel industry, steel manufacturing industry, to a company called Risco in Rhodesia. And this involved interest from the National Steel Company of Austria, European American Finance, Bermuda Limited, an offshore subsidiary of European American Bank, which was a New York bank jointly owned by 6 European banks, including Britain's Midland Bank. European Banks International, another Brussels-based subsidiary of European American Banking, and a company based in Zurich, Switzerland. The scheme was said to involve 24 million pounds, and this money had to be transferred to Rhodesia to enable it to build its steel industry. The plot became public when a British subject, Kenneth McIntosh, who had been working for one of these local banks, which were subsidiaries of British banks, came across documentation relating to this arrangement. And he sent copies of these documents to a relative of his in the UK, just as a way of trying to protect himself. He then tried to leave the country and had succeeded in doing so until he was arrested in Malawi. We heard about Banda working very closely with white rule Southern Africa and sent back to Rhodesia. He was then tried and sentenced to 5 years, but the prosecutor made a deal with his defense lawyer and said if we can go to UK and retrieve these papers, we'll reduce the sentence on McIntosh. In the meantime, the relative had passed the papers to the Sunday Mail, the British Sunday Times. And when the lawyer went to negotiate with the Sunday Times refused to hand those papers back and actually published the documents. And in the reprisal, McIntosh was retried with new charges and was given a sentence of 15 years. But there's a happy ending to this story, because within a matter of days, McIntosh had left the country, and he was held by his prison guard. He decided he wanted to go to the hospital because he wasn't feeling too well, and the British guard went with him to the hospital, telephoned the prison saying, well, we have arrived here and we should be back when everything is been sorted out. By the time that the prison tried to follow up, they were told that McIntosh and the prison guard and his family had left the country. So there's one that escaped from that. The rest of the paper then looks at how Rhodesia was able to supply its military with a lot of equipment from the very same countries that were supposed to be behind sanctions. And I'll just read you a list of the countries that send weapons. The anti-apartheid movement in England published a long expose of this arbitrary image. And the countries whose weapons found their way into the Rhodesian army and the Air Force include Italy, the USA, the UK, France, Switzerland, Jordan, Luxembourg, Israel, Belgium, Portugal, and West Germany. And among that list are the countries that are supposed to be staunch supporters of sanctions. If I could just read one little paragraph before I stop, if you allow me, in which the Secretary of State, SAHS, once writes to the President of the United States. And they're talking about the possibility of removing or rescinding the Bed Amendment. And this is what he writes. Since we, the United States, are making a major effort to repeal the Bed Amendment in this country, you may be interested to know that many other nations pay lip service to the United Nations sanctions, but do little to enforce compliance. South Africa facilitates sanction breaking by providing false certificates of origin and disguised trade channels. Rhodesian exports are often consigned to South Africa and re-exported. Although we have no official trade figures published by the Smith government, the relative health of its economy is testimony to widespread sanctions breaking. It is clear that the Japanese take more Rhodesian exports than any other country. West Germany is Rhodesia's largest trading partner in Western Europe, but there is also substantial trade with the Netherlands, France, Belgium, and Italy. Switzerland acts as Rhodesia's financial clearinghouse, and damming operations in Liechtenstein also facilitate Rhodesian trade. Rhodesian oil supplies originate from Iran and are shipped through South Africa. If we are successful in repealing the Bed Amendment, I will approach our friends in Western Europe and the Japanese about their sanctions violations. Unless we get our own house in order, however, we'll have trouble persuading our allies to observe sanctions. And I argue that this clearly evidence that sanctions were more honored in the breach than in the observance. Thank you.
I'm going to have to limit it to just 2 questions, please.
Thanks. Hello? Is this on? Well, thank you for the paper. I haven't read the version that was circulated, so my questions might be covered by your paper rather than what you presented. Just some comments and one comment and perhaps 2 questions. You mentioned almost in passing that Switzerland was the kind of financial center of sanctions busting because it was the obvious place where a lot of the money laundering and so on could happen through the Swiss banks. But it's worth noting that Henny van Vuren's book, Apartheid, Guns and Money, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with it, looks at sanctions particularly as related to weapons and how South Africa acquired weapons through all the networks that were created and the money laundering that happened through the secret NIHSS and so on, and Arms Corps and its subsidiaries. He makes a point that Brussels, perhaps even more so than Switzerland, form a very integral part of the sanctions busting schemes as far as Pretoria is concerned. And I dare say it would have, because Pretoria was so much part and parcel of Rhodesian sanctions busting, it would have been an integral part of that network as well. So that's just one comment. The other is a question. When we're talking about sanctions busting, we also got to think perhaps a bit more about how these sanctions, these materials are actually paid for, foreign currency. And is there any evidence of the money trails as regards the foreign currency that was necessary to pay for weapons, oil, as far as Rhodesia is concerned?
I have no direct evidence of that from the sources I've looked at. But the way the system works is that it works through third parties. So France is not sending this stuff directly to Salisbury. It's going to a third country, which then transfers that to Rhodesia. So I would assume that there's a mechanism by which Rhodesia pays money into that third party, who then facilitates the procurement of these items from wherever. So I don't know how the network works. I haven't looked into that. I've really sort of just based myself on these UN documents just to get a sense of how extensive was this process. But I've read the book that you've referred to about South Africa, and I think it shows that sanctions sometimes not worth the trouble, because there are always ways of going around this. I didn't get any evidence that Brussels was directly involved in the financing of sanctions in Rhodesia, whereas Switzerland, I think, is mentioned virtually in every report. But it's worth looking into.
Thank you very much indeed, Alois, for a fascinating paper. My question follows on from Gary's about Switzerland. Did you pick up evidence of Switzerland also extending lines of credit and loans to Rhodesia, as well as acting, if you like, as a money laundering clearinghouse? Sandra Bott's work on South Africa and Switzerland between 1948 and 1994 very much looks at international money flows in those terms, as well as Switzerland's assistance because of its stance of a neutral on helping to sanctions bust. And I wondered if there's any evidence of that in the material you've been able to look at.
I've not found any evidence of that, except having Swiss banks finance these networks that are busting sanctions. But I don't have any evidence of any direct funding to Rhodesian businesses or government themselves.
Thank you so much.
Okay.